Welcome to a live video recording of the Risk Matrix podcast. We're also on Spotify. We're on YouTube. This drops every Tuesday around noon, so check us out. I'm here with my colleague, Dr. Martin.
Hello, everybody. This is a live episode of the Risk Matrix. So excited to be here. Hope everybody's having a good time down there in NOLA. As James said, I'm Dr. Martin, and today we've got a special guest, Brent Kettlecamp, and he's a shareholder at Ogletree Deacons. Very knowledgeable about our subject. But before we do that, I just want to let you know that this is powered by Veriforce, but we also have sponsors that carry us forward on the show. So over to you, James.
This episode of the Risk Matrix powered by Veriforce is brought to you by our newest learning product, Safe Driver. Driving fatalities lead all causes of death across all industries, but especially in the oil and gas industry. Oil and gas workers are 27 times more likely to perish in a vehicle accident than the general public. Vehicle accidents account for 27% of the total fatalities in the oil and gas industry. For the past 30 years, Veriforce has been dedicated to bringing workers home safe from high-hazard jobs. This month, Veriforce launched Safe Driver, an instructor-led program to get workers home safe from the road. Safe Driver by Veriforce is rigorously developed to combat the high incidence of serious injuries and fatality crashes involving personal and light-duty company vehicles within the oil and gas industry. Extending beyond business operations, this course focuses on the safety of personnel during their daily commutes. Safe Driver by Veriforce is not just a course. It's a commitment to transforming driving behaviors to ensure the safety of workers in one of the most hazardous industries. So for more information and to enroll in the Safe Driver program, please contact training sales at veriforce.com. Dr. Martin.
Hey, so I know you all are sitting at tables or chairs or conference room places. And right now I want you to go to Spotify and make sure that you listen to the Risk Matrix, because we do have a wide variety of guests. We also are on Veriforce's YouTube channel. But welcome, Brent Kettlecamp, an expert in many things. He actually helps us a lot with our customers for OSHA violations and helping them get reduced and fighting against some of those things. But he's here today to talk about cybersecurity. And so welcome, Brent.
Hey everyone, my name is Brent Kettlecamp. Really excited to be here today, and thanks everyone for joining so early in the morning here. Excited to be here.
Well, I'll start us off. Yesterday, Brent, we had two tremendous guests that were here, FBI special supervisory agents, talking to us about the threats of information security and cybersecurity, whether they're international threats. It may be financial threats, whether they're financially motivated or politically motivated. It's become something that we see almost every day. When breached, our systems can result in catastrophic accidents. For example, the Russian cyber military unit Sandworm orchestrated a very large malware attack that took down the power grid in Ukraine. And then all of us, particularly in the oil and gas industry, can remember the cyber attack, ransomware attack on the Colonial Pipeline that shut down the Colonial Pipeline back in 2021. So we'd like to talk to you today about, some knowledge that you have from the legal aspects of why companies need to secure their information and cyber systems.
And that's a great question. I think the big question is just why do you care, right? And so the big essential reason is a lot of the majority of these of the breaches are happening because of phishing and ransomware attacks. And data has shown as the years have increased that a successful breach through a phishing attack is cost on average about $4.5 million per attack. And this results in massive amounts of litigation, of costs, and importantly, 295 days on average to get rid of the phishing attack. And so it's not only a monetary issue, it's not only an issue with respect to your customers. It can take down a power grid, it can take down for 295 days. And these are all absolutely just critical to businesses, and having class action litigation on a state-by-state basis. There's regulators that can come in and engage in enforcement actions against companies because of these types of scenarios. And so it's an absolute nightmare scene when there are successful phishing attacks and breaches of information security. And so when you think about why me, and they're only targeting healthcare entities, or they're only targeting X, Y, and Z. Absolutely not. They are targeting construction companies, gas and oil field, because you may think of, they just want healthcare information, but what type of information do you have? You have personal identifiable information of your employees. You probably have personal identification information of customers. You have proprietary and confidential information of your own. You have proprietary and confidential information of customers and others. They want that information. And some of that information is absolutely critical to pipeline functionality, to construction, to security, and those are absolutely critical things that they want their hands on. And so when you think that, they're only looking at hospital organizations of the world, think again, because they're after this information.
So let me give you an example here, because I know James is in oil and gas, and I do a lot of construction company consulting. And if you think that it's just looking at the power grid, or just trying to just mess with people and bring the companies down, in the construction field, and I will say here on the East Coast, we had a construction firm that was hacked. They basically were transmitting data on their piping for a pharmaceutical company. They were also transmitting data for construction equipment that was electronically, digitally controlled. They also, as buildings are being built now, buildings are automated. And so the automation of the buildings was hacked. And it did take them almost a year, Brent, as you said, 295 days, almost a year to hold off that attack. And then once they got to the point where they were secure systems, they actually were still vulnerable, right? And they've hired somebody to just do that, just to watch their data go back and forth from their subs to their clients and et cetera. So, I mean, when you're thinking about this, it's not just, terrorist type activity, it's other companies trying to get your data. It's other people trying to mess up, just mess up with your life, right? Mess up with your buildings and your automation. So,
one of the things that doing the research for this, because I'm a safety professional, I'm not a computer professional. Anybody that knows me, I struggle with email. Shared drive is some mysterious thing that's out there in cyberspace I've not yet mastered. But I was keenly, I guess, made aware through this research that a lot of the threats come to organizations through their supply chains. Like, it seems like the hiring client had a very secure network, but then something happened within one of their suppliers. Like, I was looking right here, for example, cyber attack began on a hospital through an HVAC contractor because one security guard compromised a single password. That's crazy. Any thoughts on securing the supply chain?
How do you secure that, Brent? I mean, what companies, what do they recommend?
And let me start with a little bit of from a legal perspective of an organization can be vicariously liable for data breaches occurring within the networks of systems of third-party vendors or contractors or consultants who collect, store, and use or access the business's data. And so who has access to your information, your data, is absolutely critical. and you can be held vicariously liable for acts of others to the extent that they're housing your data. And so the means and the method in which they have access is absolutely critical. And so the way that I want to approach it is talking about it from a perspective of what do you do with current vendors and what do you do with new vendors? And from the perspective of your new vendors, you have a lot more control over that situation because you don't have a master services agreement in place yet. And so what do you want to identify in a master services agreement? Data protection requirements. What are your obligations and what are their obligations to you associated with how they're going to use your data? Who's going to have access to that data? Should they have access to that data? In your master services agreement, having something like an indemnity provision in there and holding you harmless for their acts and indemnification as it relates to their bad acts to the extent that their acts causes a breach to your systems or theirs. A lot of master service agreements that I'm seeing now are giving the hiring client the ability not only to walk into facilities, but also the ability to do annual assessments. And I know James and Dr. Martin do a lot of these audits on behalf of companies. So I'm interested to hear, James and Dr. Martin, what do you do and how do you work through these audits?
Well, one of the first things I recommend companies do is some type of vulnerability assessment when it comes to their information in cybersecurity. So you have information security, but you also have operational security. It wasn't that long ago down in Florida, we actually had an attack where they were able to go beyond the informational gathering, but to the actual operations of the water systems for this town. So you shut the water off, right? We saw what happened in Ukraine with them turning the power off. That's the first time in history that an entire power grid has been breached and turned off. So a risk assessment, a vulnerability assessment should be the first part of what a company does. Now, like I say, I'm a safety expert. Supposedly, I'm not an IT expert, but a vulnerability assessment should begin with, in my opinion, a questionnaire, particularly in your supply chain. What are you doing? What are they doing to protect your information? Dr. Martin, you have any thoughts on that?
So I just want to add that yes, the questionnaire, right? But things have to be verified. Okay. So it's one thing to ask the question, but it's a whole nother thing to kind of dive into what exactly are people doing, right? I think a lot of these companies, at least the ones I look at, they do minimal awareness training for their employees on how to handle confidential information, how to handle passwords, how to respond to email attacks, and then they do some follow up, right? I mean, everybody or most people have been through those company things where they give you the Kevin Minnick training. Rest in peace, Kevin Minnick. But you get that training, and then they kind of monitor your emails to see if you click on anything, and then they tell you, oh, that's a bad thing. But I don't think that type of audit is enough, right? So what type of audits should we have, right? I mean, first of all, I think if you're handling sensitive data and you don't have your systems locked down and email is a sensitive point, then background checks. Are people doing background checks before they allow people to access any of the systems, any of the hardware, digital computers? So, I mean, I think, yes, ask the questions, but, trust but verify. So what verification?
I agree with trust but verify. But I'll say this. A lot of these phishing attacks are very sophisticated. Our little company at Mariner Gulf was hit last week. And fortunately, our CFO happens to be my wife, right? So when she got an email that imitated an email from me as if I was corresponding with this person from my email address, directing her to donate $20,000 to some Charity, she knew exactly that is not James Junkin. I can guarantee you that.
Because he would have
So,
given $50,000. So I mean,
absolutely, absolutely. So, there's no limits to my generosity in cyberspace.
That was my charity, James.
That was?
Yeah.
I know.
Roll Tide, bro.
Brent Cattle Camp
Now,
charity.
if it had been to the NIL fund for the University of Alabama, it might have gone through, Brent. It might have gone through. But they are very sophisticated. And I think that's where employee training comes in, because a lot of the training we have, very rudimentary. Most of the people that are here in our live audience probably have extensive IT departments, probably have extensive training when it comes to information and cybersecurity. My question and concern is always in the supply chain, because now we're sharing all sorts of data within our networks because the speed of business is at the pace of the internet. Paper is going away, even in the site safety sides of these things. So when you're looking at vulnerabilities and a vulnerability assessment, it has to extend to your supply chain. The smaller the company gets, the more likelihood there's going to be vulnerabilities. I mean, an example I gave earlier, an HVAC contractor was breached, and that HVAC contractor, because of that breach and their relationships with Target, exposed millions of people's personal data. I think there was credit card data that might have been exposed, all through the vulnerability of the HVAC contractor. Now, who would have thought of that at the beginning, right? My HVAC contractor is coming out to work on our HVAC system. Surely that doesn't relate to our cybersecurity, our information security. So vulnerability assessments right at the front, I think, are very important. But Brent, let's talk about this. When we have an incident, what's the response? Is there a response plan? What do we need to be doing from a response standpoint, and maybe from a legal standpoint once we've had a breach? Because it seems like it's not a matter of if, but when.
Right. And so I think we can, before you talk about what do we do if it's breached, I think the question from a business standpoint is, have you prepared for the breach? Do you have a data avoidance plan? And what does that plan say? And part of that data breach avoidance plan is having a plan and a breach plan of what do we do if we are breached. And so what I always recommend that companies have is a breach response plan. And this is effectively your A team, right? Where you have your IT and your security, probably your chief technology officer that's going to run the day-to-day operations as to the mitigation. You'll have someone from your IT and your security running the background of, okay, what happened? How can we stop this? How can we mitigate this? And this is your team that you have in place. You've already identified these individuals in your breach response plan. Each individual knows what his or her role is as a part of this, and you've done training on this. And so if something happens, everyone activates, and you know that my job is to do X, Y, and Z. And this is going to be specific to each organization because all organizations run differently. And so you'll have your legal representative engaging third parties, IT consultants, breach consultants. You have your outside legal counsel telling you, informing you what type of notice obligations that you may have. And Dr. Martin's favorite statement is, well, what are my breach notification requirements? And it depends,
Just
right?
depends.
It
Don't
depends.
do it. Don't encourage that. Dr. Martin, Simon used your phrase
It just
yesterday. You were
depends.
quoted well here.
I made
Don't
myself
encourage it.
I made myself a mug the other day that said it just depends on it. It turned off really ugly, and I would have
Best
had it on the
answer
show.
ever.
But yeah, it just depends. But as we go down this road, Brent, I just want to mention process, and part of the process in this data breach response plan is in the contractor, in the hiring contractor, who owns the data, right? Who owns the data, right? And you don't need to put the safety person on your response team. You might, right? But in a construction firm, that might be something, because anybody who handles data, uploads data, puts data into the system, accesses data, at least on a departmental level, should be consulted as this team assembles and starts to make a data breach response plan. I just
So
wanted to add that in.
I want to shift. I think we've made the point that we need to secure these things and have a response plan that begins with assessment. I want to shift a little bit, and I apologize, but you'll probably be able to handle this question. I didn't brief him ahead of time. Electronic discovery. Securing your information for electronic discovery. I know right over here, when this casino was Harris Hotel and Casino before it was Caesars, they had a scaffolding incident. And during the discovery process, they failed to turn over a lot of text messages about this incident that were held on private individuals' cell phones, emails, messaging apps, things of that nature. That resulted in a directed verdict in federal court of $50 million. So as we're talking about securing your information, let's kind of shift out of the emergency terrorism role or political or financial hacking to what should we be doing with our information security in preparation for litigation?
And that's a great question. And so when you have when something happens in anticipation of litigation, you have an obligation to hold that data. A lot of people think when they think of ESI, they think of emails. There are so many new and different mediums that people are using to communicate with employees and contractors now. We have Slack, we have text messages, we have GroupMe, we have all these different mediums where people are communicating business information. And so I've had several conversations with employers asking for this information, and it's, oh, we don't have that information. We don't save our cell phone text messages, or we don't save our Slack text messages or emails back and forth. That is a problem from an ESI standpoint. And so making sure that when the litigation hold letter goes out, you have an obligation to save and store all ESI, not just limited to your emails. And so having, again, a robust policy where you have information and expectations of how that information will be stored and saved is critical. We have a question in the audience. I'll tell the question for the, I'll read it, the question for the audience. And so the question was, a lot of companies have document management or destruction processes whereby they will be destroying documents on a 30-day basis or a 90-day basis. A lot of times you see that CTV video just writes over itself after 90 days. And so the question is there a problem to the extent that there is a lawsuit that comes up and you no longer have that data and information? Again, Dr. Martin, you're going to smile. It depends, right? Is to the extent that you are not following your data destruction plan or you are not keeping it in a way that is consistent with what you say you're doing, that's a problem. And that's the same for cybersecurity. If you say that you have certain security and IT standards and it's written in your policy and it's consumer facing and you're not doing it, and you have a data breach, this has a lawsuit written all over it where you're just not fulfilling your obligations. And so same thing here is that to the extent that you have the policies, you need to comply with it. But as it relates to just normal rewriting or overwriting of things, it's not necessarily a problem unless and until you have a scenario where it's in anticipation of litigation and then your obligation will be triggered there.
You know, and I also think, Brent, what happens is many times we are very focused on what we say in emails, but we're very loose in a lot of the things we say in text messages, apps, instant messages, things of that nature, and sometimes carry on private conversations where we say things that we might come back to haunt us at the deposition. So how should companies go about getting this information down to the employee lead level, the frontline supervisor level, maybe even the contractor level in anticipation? Because once we have an incident and once people have already said the things that they've said, it's kind of too late to close the barn door at that point. How do we get get that information to people? What's your
And
recommendation?
a lot of times you hear people say, let's take this offline, and the offline becomes text messages, right? And the text messages become the best pieces of litigation. And so so many of my cases that I'm handling, the meat is in the text messages. It's no longer in the emails because people know what I write in emails. People are going to read it. But now it's, okay, what do you write in text messages? What are you writing in Slack? And James, your question of what do you do? How do you train employees? This is the part of your robust training process where it's just not a training where people are watching a screen and putting it on mute and doing other things. Having it be an interactive training where people are forced, even if they don't want to, forced to interact, forced to engage. That's the type of training that's necessary in order for people who are busy in getting things done, in order to make sure that they know what they're doing and to make sure that they understand and appreciate the impact of what they're doing and how it may impact the organization and others.
So I think that's a great point, right? And I love that the point of training and having real live examples. I think it's very illustrative to use stuff like when an incident happens, and the first thing people do is they start texting each other. Oh my gosh, that guy died. Oh my gosh, so and so shouldn't have done that, right? And I think that through your practice and probably James's practice, that you've seen, like you said, the meat is in the text messages, and to the extent that that can be used as a way to show what can happen, what the liability is, what the loss will be to the company, or just business as a whole, to the supply chain as a whole. It's very important to illustrate that with real examples, because this is where people go to jail. This is where people change the course of where the data goes, where the investigation goes.
So let me ask you this: a lot of companies issue company-issued cell phones, right? But every now and again, business gets conducted on these personal cell phones, or they don't issue a company cell phone, or there's a blend of this cell phone is personal use and company use. To what extent do we need to be concerned about electronic discovery requests for productions for personal cell phones of our employees?
That's a legitimate concern, and there's state law requirements as to how that works. And so again, you may be faced with a scenario where you're going to have to identify what state may apply what you're doing. But your ability to control what an individual does with his or her personal cell phone in some circumstances is limited. If you are paying for that device, you may have more control over it. But the way and the means that you have a cell phone and the way that they're using it is going to be dependent on how much control you have over it. And you don't necessarily have control over my ability on my personal cell phone. I can delete things, and you have no ability to give it back and to get the information back in some circumstances. And we've had several forensics companies try to get data off of a personal cell phone because this individual deleted it before. So it is a problem. And so having businesses encourage their employees to be doing business activities on business devices is important.
Yeah. So we kind of got off topic there, Brent, as you were talking about assembling the team, right? We got to assembling the team, and then looking at the vendor list and looking at what do you engage counsel? Do you have interior counsel that can help you? But what is the management plan? What is the management plan? What does it look like when a breach happens, or it needs to be in that management plan beforehand?
And so the critical to the breach plan is your key players. All of these key players know their role. All of these key players know what their marching orders are going to be, and they know what the response is going to be. And I think critically is organizations, and there are companies that do this, and this is the only thing they do. They test breach response plans. They test it, they audit it. You have to test this, you have to audit this, and you have to train your employees on it. A lot of companies on a quarterly basis will take their breach response plan and put it into action on a fake or a simulated event and circumstances to see and identify what is happening, who the major players are, what they're doing, what their obligations are, if they're following what they should be doing, and fixing the plan and fixing what their approach would be. And again, there's no magic wand as to what this looks like for each organization has to do this differently, because each organization has different players, and some may not have IT, some may outsource IT, some may outsource HR, some may not have an internal counsel, some may have only outside counsel. And so it's going to be specific to your organization, but making sure that you have this plan in place, you have your A team in place, and that you've tested it and it's audited and you're changing it. Make this a flexible document, make it a flexible plan, because if you don't, no one's going to know what they're doing if you're not testing and auditing this.
Well, I like to say, after an incident, it's too late to start drawing it up in the dirt, right?
Right.
Of what our plan's going to be, because there are vulnerabilities in the information side, but also the operational side.
Well, let's address a different topic here that we kind of were touching upon, and I think this is something people need to know, because I know both you and Brent, and a lot of times I'm getting pulled in now. We do a lot of post-incident investigations that involve OSHA violations, that involve, now we're getting to the safety side, right? That involve OSHA violations or private party lawsuits. And when we start talking about communications, what is the best thing to do? I know, and I'm just going to say the first thing I do is call you or Brent, James or Brent, right? And then what? And then what, right? Because you want to protect the company in the way that you can protect the company and start to draw it up in the dirt, because sometimes that's just the way it happens.
And I think one of the most critical assessments you have to make is, who do we need to hire? Is this a scenario where we need to hire outside counsel? And are we going to have a safety consultant come in? I think the first question you need to ask yourself is, do we want the potential to have this investigation be privileged? And so that assessment is critical. On your first step is, do we need a lawyer, and how can we make this privileged if necessary? If you engage a safety consultant without any type of legal counsel, that investigation, the advice, the recommendations, the conclusions, that may not be privileged. But if you do it the other way around, where you have an attorney involved and you engage counsel, and the counsel engages the safety consultant for purposes of doing a privileged investigation, then you have some cover and ability to manage how and what information you're going to be giving to whether it's plaintiff's counsel or some regulatory agency.
So I'll say this, and given my opinion, which is totally supportive of what Brett just said.
It just depends.
Brent just said, there you go again. When you're in a serious injury or fatality situation, you're going to be inspected by OSHA. And there's a tendency for companies to give OSHA everything they ask for. However, they may not be entitled to that. And you may be leaving yourself up in the information insecurity that you're giving to OSHA, which could be subject to Freedom of Information Act request by the plaintiff's counsel who's going to be involved in this investigation. So I always say, if it's a serious injury, especially if it's a fatality, you need counsel early, whether that's inside counsel or outside counsel, to help guide you through that process, particularly the discovery and the production process. When it comes to OSHA, they're not entitled to everything, and just understand what you give them may be subject to discovery by the plaintiff's counsel in some type of wrongful death situation. So today we've talked about a lot of different variations of information in cybersecurity. Some of them are threats from the outside. Some of them are threats, from financial, international bad actors. But some of them are just normal course of business. You have a question?
One of the things that my company is seen as a challenge is the email titles and trying to figure out which emails are pertinent, because you can have a ton of emails that have a terrible title. So if you want to term search your email blocks, you would never find it. It might even say per my last email, right? So throwing out that might be something interesting. Something else that's come up for us is the way that you request that attorney-client privilege. At least the legal advice that we've given internally is that there's a very specific recipe, and if you don't follow all the ingredients in that recipe, even if you've got an attorney on the chain, it may not be privileged. So understanding what your total recipe looks like might be really important.
Right. And I will just add to that, don't wait, right? A lot of times, and I've seen this with Brent and James and some of the things I hear about that they're doing, that something happens and then a year later they're like, oh boy, we probably should get counsel involved and safety expert. And when something bad happens, that action plan needs to be ready to go. And that recipe that you're talking about, that recipe needs to be in place so that this is immediate, right? And everybody knows what to put on their emails. Everybody knows they're calling Brent or myself or James, and the recipe is going to begin immediately, especially in a hazardous incident or an injury or illness.
And a lot of times, to your point, a lot of people assume that just because you CC me on an email, it's privileged. That's not necessarily the case. And so the making sure that you have only the focus management group on the email, making sure that those folks aren't talking with others about those conversations that you're having with counsel, making sure that the communications you're having with legal counsel are for the purposes of providing legal advice or at the direction of counsel. All that mix that you're talking about, absolutely, and making sure that your management team appreciates and understands what that mix needs to be in order for this to be maintained, because to your point, there's a lot of opportunities for that privilege to be broken if it's not used correctly.
And I'll say this as we sum this up related to your question. My experience has been, we have an incident, OSHA is going to be on the ground in the next 2 or 3 days, right? And everybody's really focused on this incident. We do the investigation, we go through the process, and OSHA might stretch it out 6 months, but we're going to know pretty soon. Wrongful death, gross negligence claims, depending on the state, that lawsuit could come the day the statute of limitations expires, 2 years later or 1 year later. It's in that gap where things get murky, where people forget, where they violate the privilege and things become unprivileged, and that information is no longer secure within your organization. It's now fair game in the wild. So I think probably the best way to end this is have a plan, test your plan, understand where your vulnerabilities are, put in corrective actions, train your employees, and man, that sounds a lot like what we do in safety.
Yeah.
With regards to the information.
Keep training your employees. Rinse and repeat, right? Rinse and repeat. Keep doing this as an iterative process. Thanks to Brent Kettlecamp, shareholder at Ogletree and Deacons, for being our gracious guest today. Go out there, hit that like button, smash, subscribe, and be a part of this thing that we call the risk matrix.
Closing thoughts, Brent?
Last closing thought is you have to have a data breach avoidance plan in place before a breach happens. So have your data map, know what data you have, how it's collected, who's using it, who has access to it, know the laws that may apply to you, the type of data that you have, your data security measures, whether it's your policies, your practices, assessing your third-party relationships, the things that we talked about, all the things that we talked about today are all in your data breach avoidance plan. Put it in writing. Make sure it's in writing. Train people on it. That's the best and most effective measure that you can do in preventing a data breach. Send internal employee phishing emails to see if people just click on stuff. That is a critical way for employees to realize with a hands-on basis that I should not have clicked on that. Those are the easiest ways for phishing attacks to happen, is just clicking on a link. And so have that data avoidance plan in place, make it active, train your employees on it.
And have an organizational culture where if people do accidentally click on something, that they can notify the management team, your IT team, without fear of reprisal before things get worse. But again, we're almost out of time, but thank you, live audience. Thank you for coming out. Thank you. Give yourselves a round of applause. First time we've done this. And to follow up with Dr. Martin, get over there on that risk matrix on YouTube channel for Veriforce. Hit that like button, smash that subscribe button. We're also on Spotify. If you like Miss Georgia's presentation yesterday, we've got an episode on something similar. There you go, Miss Georgia, on how to balance a just culture with employee discipline. So we're talking about things like that all the time, always looking for great guests. Thank you for coming out this morning. Thank you for what you do for bringing home workers safe from high hazard jobs. And thank you, Veriforce, for powering our podcast.